It's great to meet you. Thank you for taking a minute out today. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. I'm so happy to be here.
Me
Yeah.
too. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. So before we get into your fascinating line of work, I want to
Sure.
know 4 years ago, the pandemic, we were all wrapping our heads around it in May. How did you make it through the pandemic and how did it change you?
My business actually flourished.
Yeah.
Actually, um, I actually heard an interesting take from because one of the things I do in my line of work is astrology. Astrology is a tool that I use to help coach people. Sometimes Trojan horse variety if they're not open to the woo part of it. But the astrologer I learned from had this really interesting take where he felt that people whose lives were affected by the pandemic, it was meant to be a kind of a spiritual course correction to help people get on track. And so, because I was already in my line of work, and there were people that were noticing this shift in awareness, because with the shutdowns, with the lockdowns, people were having more time to reflect. Like, what do they really want in a career? What do they really want? Like, people were starting to think more about like things like purpose and legacy, at least from what I was seeing. And so my business actually was booming during that time because I had people coming to me like looking for those answers. So I actually experienced it, um, as someone who intuitively, empathically can sense a lot of like what is going on in the greater collective because of the things like slowing down and some people getting to, you know, the people that weren't panicked about it that actually could, be like, oh wow, I get to work from home or I get to take some time off. It was actually very calming for me. But then again, I also had the benefit of using astrology to know that something big was coming months prior before COVID. And so when it hit, I was like, yeah, this isn't going to be what they say it is. And I got almost burned at the stake like a witch for saying it because, no one knew. No one really knew,
Yeah.
really like with what the media was saying. So yeah, my story is actually really interesting in that, Joe, where I actually like thrived, during that time. And so for me, it was just a lot of holding space for people to work through their fears to come out of it the other side, to see that life was more than worth living, not in a place of fear. So
It's interesting. Around March 3rd of 2020, my wife
mm,
and I went to the art gallery here in Kansas City, the Nelson Atkins, and there was a concert. My other incarnation is a jazz radio host, so I go to
yeah,
shows. And
yeah.
there was a guitar player named Bill Frisell, real eclectic cat. So
Mm,
he's there, and my wife, because I've taken her to all these shows, we've been married since 2019. So she's been getting baptized in jazz. She was like, what do I expect from this show? I'm like, I don't know. He's just that kind of guy. But it was a wonderful show. And at one point, about halfway through, Petra Hayden is a wonderful singer, and she was with the group, the trio. And they start singing We Shall Overcome. And everybody in
mm,
the crowd just starts rising up and everybody
mm,
starts swaying and singing it. And now that
mm.
after that happened and I was looking at the world shutting down a week and a half later, it was like we were cattle before a tornado came. We all had this like preternatural notion that something big was coming without even knowing it. Because at that
Yeah,
point, there might have been a case or two of COVID in Kansas and Missouri combined. So it's
sure.
weird how that's the thing too.
Yeah.
I'm sure in your line of work, you felt there was something was brewing.
Oh, absolutely. I can remember when it was big news in China and there was no reports here yet. And I just was looking at it and just kind of feeling into it. I'm like, oh, this is the thing. This is that big thing. Because what's interesting about astrology is like you can go back and look at past major historical events and see what were some of the slower moving planets doing during that time. And so that you can look at those patterns of like what's happened in history. And so there was this pattern of an event that only happened every 700-800 years where the planets Saturn, Pluto came together, and that's like when the plagues were happening. That's when things like the Napoleon War were happening. So it's like basically anything that shook the whole world, you'd have to live under a rock, to not be affected by it. And I actually did meet some people that actually were out in the woods, kind of like Jared Leto was when the whole
Yeah,
pandemic. They came back and was like, "What is going on here?"
yeah.
This guy this guy was living in the woods. He came back. He had no clue what was going on. He'd completely disconnected from everyone, which probably wasn't the healthiest thing, living in the woods. And then He comes back, everyone's wearing a mask. He's confused. He walks into a store because he hasn't had a haircut. And he's like, he sees a red hat. He's like, "Oh, make America great again. That seems patriotic. I'll grab that." Going anything about the Trump. No. And then like, why are all these people looking at me weird? It's just like just got this hat. Like,
That it reminds me of an episode of Curb Your Enthusiasm. That's just like the whole thing. It's like you accidentally walk into this realm. That's bizarre, man. That's totally
yeah,
bizarre, you know?
yeah,
And who would have ever thought that a red hat would carry on that connotation from here on out? Because I still
right.
see a red hat and I'm like, What?" And I mean, it's just a red
Yeah,
hat, but
yeah,
you
yeah,
know, it's like
yep,
waving the flag for the bull in Spain, it's wild. Um,
yeah.
so let's get to the heart and soul of what you do on a daily basis. I'm going to put you in front of a bunch of third graders. It's career day. One of the kids says, "Hey, what do you do for a living?" How do you answer that child?
Yeah, I like to tell them that I'm an intuitive coach and astrologer, and I especially like to work in the boardroom, meaning executives, CEOs, entrepreneurs, basically just anyone that has tough decisions to make in their life. They've got a team that they're leading, they've got a family that they're leading, they've got responsibilities. They're leaders, and so what I like to do is use things that I know that I probably shouldn't know, but somehow do to help them make those decisions every day.
So, what did you want to be in the third grade? What was your dream?
I wanted to be an architect, and in a weird way, I kind of became that just in a different way.
Yeah.
With I like learning about law of attraction and manifestation, and creating what the dreamscape looks like before it becomes real. So
So, take me back to your childhood. Where were you born and raised, and how did you acquire this skill of astrology and being intuitive and helping people? How did all of
yeah,
this evolve into you?
yeah. So I was born and raised in St. Louis, Missouri, so Midwest kid, very traditional, upbringing in terms of like, what's expected of a boy, of a masculine. I was a very sensitive boy growing up, and there wasn't a lot of like welcoming energy from my dad, from the other kids at school for that. Um, my mom was not in the home after a certain age, around age 5 or 6. And so my sensitivities, the level of empathy that I had, I think was not nurtured or really understood. So like it was really kind of perceived as just being kind of like a whiny boy, so to speak, and didn't really have an understanding of the things that I was experiencing as a child. So I grew up, going to school, getting good grades, eventually get to college, become a construction project manager post college. And so I'm out, you know, building things and in places across the nation here in the US. And that was great. I got to experience leadership in that way. But about 8 years into it, my health was really suffering. I didn't know it at the time, but like some traumas in life had were starting to kind of surface. They were starting to manifest as like physical dis-ease in the body, and so we were starting to get really slow with work. And so there was a layoff that occurred, and then a couple months later, I had a random house fire. So I'm just like, what is going on in my life? Like it's just like falling apart. I meet this woman, like probably the worst time of my life to consider dating, because I'm like trying to figure out the rest of it. But I was trying to figure out my physical health, but I was not looking at any of the real emotional, mental, spiritual distresses of things. I'd heard of them through going down the self-development rabbit hole of trying to fix myself, make myself feel better, get my life together. But she had a spiritual background, and so I got to see these actual like real life things in action, like tarot cards and astrology and pendulums and intuition. And so I'm like, wow, this is real. And so the relationship ultimately didn't work out, but it was a Trojan horse moment that led me to becoming more curious about astrology and starting to follow it for because I was looking for answers and guidance so to figure my life out. And then that astrologer, only a couple of weeks into following him, said, "Hey, I'm doing an astrology school. It costs this much." He put it out on his app. He was the first astrologer to put out his own app. And I signed up for it. And Joe, it was the most fun I've ever had in my life, like learning anything. And it came so naturally to me. It took someone actually asking for an astrology reading to gain the confidence of like what I knew, the wisdom with it. But the rest, as they say, is history after that first reading. So I've been doing that piece professionally since 2018, and then there were other components that came with it as well. And then what really accelerated the journey, I would say, in addition to the astrology piece, was the spiritual awakening side of it, where it was like, starting to feel my intuition working, like things that like, wait, how did I know this thing or sense this thing, or synchronicities, or like, I would be reading a book and then I wouldn't feel like reading it for a few days. And then all of a sudden I'd feel the calling to pick it up and read it. And I would read the next paragraph and it would be the exact thing that I was just going through in my life at that time. And then I had an opportunity to go sit with ayahuasca medicine in Peru. And so that was just like, oh, okay, confirms like everything that I'm experiencing. You go into this like shamanic hallucinogenic field, dimethyltryptamine, DMT, and it's just like, okay, yep, confirmation. There's no going back from here. And so it was this full blown spiritual awakening. And then since then, it's just been the integration of like, okay, what do I do with this? How do I help people with this? How do I, release and heal from my past traumas so I'm not carrying, those emotional charges or those negative beliefs? And so it's been a path of my own, healing, but also like that role modeling to help others too from a path of service with the coaching and that the more that I've healed.
So, who's been kind of a hero or role model for you in your life?
I would definitely say the first person that comes to mind actually is the astrologer that I learned from, because there's a lot of women that carry the torch when it comes to like the spiritual component of things. And so it's a little more rare for a man to be doing it. And he started doing it very, very early on, like around 2012, before, spirituality was sort of more of like becoming more of an accepted component, available to people, having its own little like kind of slice of the pie in the mainstream. And because of his consistency, his dedication, the guy did a horoscope like every day for like 10 years or something like that. He had people telling him all these negative things about what he was doing. It's satanic, you're the devil, all this stuff. And the fact that like witnessing someone that felt a calling of a path of service to stay so committed to helping people in spite of any pushback or any stress of like the things that he was building, to me that was inspirational, because he went and took a concept and a dream, kind of like Walt Disney. It's like, I have this thing inside of me now. How do I build it though? Like, how do I take like what this vision is and actually make it real in the physical reality? And he was able to do that, and he continues to do it.
And unfortunately, in the realm of astrology, there's so many people out there that are naysayers that say things
Sure.
that are just totally inaccurate. What's one thing about being on the inside of this profession that you could say that people probably just don't realize that would reassure them as to the comfort that you've gotten out of this? Like, what would you say to them?
Yeah, one thing I like to start with, Joe, is kind of like normalizing it a little bit. Like this idea that the scientific community has accepted that the moon affects the high and low tides of the ocean, right? Our bodies are comprised of around 50% water, so if it affects the ocean, can it possibly, affect what's going on in our physiology? It's like you talk to any nurse, especially the ones that work in the ER, they'll tell you like, oh, the full moon's coming. It's like they may not even know it's a full moon, but they can tell you that something's going on because people start acting different, because there's this idea that the water element represents our emotions, the way that the tears flow when we're emotional. And so I start to kind of just like normalize that. I talk about how the cosmos, the sun, the moon, the stars, the planets, they do follow a predictable pattern, like it without fail, it never changes. But here, the only guarantee the joke goes, right, is death and taxes. And
Yeah.
so the fact that things feel so unpredictable here, that there's a lot of, ancient civilizations, although the history books may report them as like unsophisticated, like maybe the Egyptians or the Mayans. There's so many cultures that look to the cosmos like for guidance, for understanding. So once I've established that amount of normalcy, then it's really just seeing, is the person that or the audience that I'm speaking in front of open or receptive enough? Because there's this idea that you have that left side of the brain, the right side of the brain. The hemispheres can communicate with each other, the logical side and the abstract side, if there's a level of openness and receptivity to, like, well, let me just see if astrology might be real. Like, tell me something about my sign, like I'm a Capricorn. Like, tell me about what's going on with me right now. And then I do it and they're like, actually, that's right. So then they can have that experience. But when someone's a skeptic, then there's like a firewall that divides the hemispheres of the brain, and people can't have their actual own experience. And so I encourage it as like, astrology's not, it's not a religion, it's not a belief, like it's a tool actually for helping people explore their experience in life, so that instead of having a hardwired belief system that actually may be making them sick and tired and not successful, to let their experiences define their belief system instead. Like, oh, I had this experience, it was amazing, now I'm a believer in it.
So, what has been one of your favorite client success stories?
Oh, so many good ones. The first one that comes to mind is a gentleman that I work with. He lives out in San Diego. He just opened up a clinic where he does coaching, and his fiance does acupuncture work. And so they're out there serving the community. And so when I first started working with him, a lot of nervousness, a lot of tension in the body, a lot of like looking for answers. Some wounding around, money. Like, he had a trauma early on with his dad, where his dad like lost his job and money was a struggle. And so he was this young kid that was like witnessing that shock, in the central nervous system of all that. And so what's happened with him over time is he's become more confident with his ability to create what he needs to create. He just feels more like a leader. Like, when his fiance, when his lady is like going through anything emotionally, he stays really solid in himself. He's no longer collapsing into like a wounded boy, type of energy, right? He's matured a lot into like this leadership. And that's one of my favorite stories, because I feel like we need more of that. We need more positive masculine role models showing like what a safe masculine, leader looks like in this day and age, because there's been a lot of like turmoil around that piece of it these past few years.
Yeah, I agree. So, of all of the things that you've done in your life up to this point, what are you the proudest of?
Oh, great question. This is going to come off as a shameless plug, but I actually was a contributing author, a co-author in a book called "Shift with Intention and Soar: A Guide to Manifesting Your Best Life." And I was really proud of that accomplishment, just because I had a couple of things. One was, the harder I tried to write the perfect chapter, the more it eluded me. And then the chapter that actually went into the book came out in one shot in like 10 minutes. Like, it just flowed out. And so I was able to very creatively talk about my experience and my journey, and actually summarize my journey in a very poetic way, from even my earlier years in life to just, recent challenges in life, and that how I like to serve now. And so it was a great opportunity to put that work out there as a showcasing of positive masculine role modeling, but also something that I can always remind myself to go back to that map, if you will, about, where I've been and like where I'm going.
So, everyone has a perception of you, family, friends, clients, but you run the show. What's your perception of you? Who do you think you are?
I consider myself a steward of the collective, meaning that um, the level of self-awareness I like to practice, and that can show up just as intuition, is being considerate of the impact that I'm having. My thoughts, my words, my actions, my beliefs. Um, there's this understanding that's being more backed by the science community now, that we are electromagnetic beings, that we have a frequency. Essentially, there's even the Heart Math Institute that's learned to measure that the heart actually puts off stronger vibrations than even the thoughts do. And so this can show up, as like when everyone's feeling like really negative or somber, and you walk into the room and you're like, oh my God, like who died? But then you sometimes walk into a room where people are happy and jovial, and it's like, wow, this feels really good. And so what I've discovered in some of my studies is that this frequency that sometimes people may just feel in a room actually stretches way further than that, up to a 19-mile radius. And so I'm looking at it through this lens of like, even if I'm not interacting with someone, my state, my vibration that I'm in, like, is having this butterfly like ripple effect of what's being put out. There's this concept that we are a collective, a collective consciousness, essentially, that we're all connected in that way, like through a natural rhythm. And so that level of stewardship is like, it's like in every moment, it's like, and it works for me too because it's my own happiness, but how can I put out positive frequency in all aspects that's is a positive contribution to the world in that way?
So if anyone out there wants to pick up this book you had mentioned, or hire you, or learn more about what you're doing, reach out. What's the good business? How can they do that?
Yeah, so best way to reach me is my website. It's astrology by ericrosen.com. So that's astrology by is BY. And then of course my name, ERICROSEN.com.
So before we get out of the door here, when I was in college, I took a cosmology course, and there was a guy I was writing for a newspaper at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, called the University News, and he was a photographer. And we were studying Pluto, and Clyde Tombaugh was the one that discovered it. His name was Doug, and I was like, this is going to seem weird, but did anybody in your lineage discover Pluto? And he was like, oh yeah, crazy Uncle Clyde. He found it and told me the whole story, and it was pretty cool. So, obviously it's been demoted. I don't know if it's been re-administered as an actual planet, but I always think about Clyde whenever I think about Pluto and its effect. I mean, and I think people minimize it because of its size out there, but it does have quite a seismic impact on everything, doesn't it?
It does. It absolutely does. The thing I find really interesting about NASA and the astronomy community declassifying it as a planet and into a dwarf star is that in astrology, the energy of Pluto is actually deals with things like death, rebirth, new beginnings. If you're familiar with like the phoenix rising from
Yep.
the ashes, it's where we go into the shadows to sort of resurrect our vitality for life, and it also deals with a lot of like taboo subjects too, like sex and the occult, like things like astrology or like tarot, and just things that are more metaphysical and don't have the full evidence of the scientific backing. And so it's interesting because there's sometimes I wonder if some of these things that happen, like, is there a motivation behind these things? Like, what impact does this have on the psyche of human beings? Like, for example, for years everyone was like, the Simpsons, they're predicting this, they're predicting this, they're predicting this. And it's like, actually, we're starting to realize, like, no, they knew what they were going to do all along. They've just like kind of been hurting people to think a certain way,
Yeah.
so that when those events actually happen, people don't like react like, what the heck is going on here? And it's a little bit more normal because they saw it on The Simpsons.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's so interesting. Man,
I
this has
mean,
been, what's that?
yeah, I was just going to say, you look at how many times the things on The Simpsons have actually
Uh-huh.
happened.
Uh-huh.
Either the writing that is Nostradamus, a prophet that needs to be doing more than just writing
Yeah.
Simpsons episodes, or there's something that's been planned ahead of time.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And that just adds to the fodder of human beings trying to figure it out. So that's pretty cool. Hey man, this
Absolutely.
has been great. Thank you, sir. Thank you for your story. Thank you for your time. Keep doing the great work.
Absolutely. I appreciate being here. Thank you so much.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Take care.